Here we are back with the history of the papacy in 10 minutes or less, or at least we try, definitely no more than 15 minutes. Now, today we're going to learn that just war is more than just a theory. Today we're going to talk about the just war theory and how it relates to the recently released papal encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which was released in October of 2020. Now, we can't possibly do justice to an idea that's so all-encompassing as the just war theory. The idea of war being permissible if it meets certain criteria and rules of war has been debated and thought about for millennia. If Pope Francis can attempt to thoroughly alter this vast concept in under 1,200 words, we can do at least as well in 10 minutes. Now, let's just talk quickly about the concept of just war, and it really goes back at least to classical antiquity. And the basic outline is war is generally a bad thing, but it can be okay, at least if, and sometimes under certain circumstances. The idea of when and how a war can be acceptable is discussed in detail, at least in the church context, by theologians like Augustine of Hippo in the 400 CE and Thomas Aquinas in the 1200 CE. And it's later discussed and hammered out even further by philosophers and of all stripes and theologians all the way and policymakers all the way up to the present time. Every war is really evaluated under this rubric of the just war theory. So it's extremely difficult to summarize basically 2,000 years plus of history of just war theory into so shortly, but we can definitely get a broad outline. Now, there's three considerations on war. There's jus ad bellum, jus in bellum, and then jus post bellum. And then let's talk first about jus ad bellum, or the justification for going to war. Somebody who's going to war must meet certain criteria. It must be a state that declares war. That state must have a good enough reason, they must have a reasonable expectation for victory, and they must have the means that they use during the war must be appropriate to the goal. So a valid state must declare war, and they can't go overboard, but they also can't go too low with what they use for this war. So winning must be an option, and you can't go overboard with that force, and you must meet every one of those criteria for the war to be considered just. Underlying all of that is war must always be the last resort, but a preemptive attack might be considered just under certain circumstances. Going forward, we have jus in bellum, or the way war is fought, and that ties into that last criteria of jus ad bellum, that force must be proportional, and there must be discrimination. So looking at discrimination, combatant must look at who is a legitimate target in war, who is a combatant and who isn't, and what can you do and not do as combatants, and what can you do to non-combatants, and attacks on non-combatants or civilians should be avoided at all costs. Then there's also proportionality, or how much force can be used. You can kill enough soldiers to get them to stop their attack, but say in a counterattack, you can't kill everyone. So the idea of no quarter is not acceptable under just war theory. Then you have jus in bellum, concerns of how soldiers are to behave in war and what protections they get as lawful legal combatants. Soldiers' rights and responsibilities are laid down quite clearly. Non-uniformed guerrilla fighters, asynchronous fighters, net wars, and that sort of thing, they lie right now in a really blurry gray area when it comes to just war. Last but not least, we have jus post bellum. All of the above need to be respected after the war is over, and settlements after the war should be fair and not punitive. So a lot of very interesting things discussed in those three criteria, and we could really think and talk about them endlessly, and people who have spent their entire lives and careers on those things. So obviously, all of those things are meant to temper war and recognize that war should be avoided, but wars probably will happen. Now, there's no single enforcement agency for compliance. There's the UN, Hague courts, various treaties, the Court of Public Opinion, and others. There's really highly technical, legal, and philosophical issues involved that aren't easily parsed. There's recent examples of justified wars, absolutely unjustified wars, and then wars that are very questionable. Christianity in general, and the Roman Catholic Church and popes in particular, have always been involved in this conversation of refining and revising the concept of the just war theory. That is until Fratelli Tutti, this encyclical of October 2020. Let's listen to just a few minutes of an interview I did with Glenn Amorosia, a really highly interested amateur expert of papal encyclicals, where we discuss Pope Francis's new take on the just war theory, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. Well, I guess my first question is, because we could get in a long discussion of that, and I'm sure people are going to get into a long discussion about that, but what kind of weight or how will this affect going forward in a time after Pope Francis? Does this become a precedent at this point, or can the next pope say, well, no, we're going to go back to the pre Fratelli Tutti days with something like just war theory?
When it comes to the just war theory, like I said, Steve, will it be interpreted? And here's the exact quote. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. Never again war. That's the exact quote from this document. Now, the way I interpret it is there is no such thing, the way he interprets it, as a just war. I think other people will interpret it otherwise. So yes, you're right. We could get a pope who comes out, after Francis sometime and work around it. The popes try to work it together. I don't think you will ever see a pope come out and advocate war. It's just a matter of in what cases can violence be used. And here's the quote that I was looking for earlier. Speaking of the United Nations, to this end, there is a need to ensure the uncontested rule of law and tireless recourse to negotiation, mediation, and arbitration, as proposed by the Charter of the United Nations, which constitutes truly a fundamental juridical norm. War can easily be chosen by invoking all sorts of allegedly humanitarian, defensive, or precautionary excuses, and even resorting to the manipulation of information. And that's where he comes out and says, never again war. He says you can come up with all sorts of excuses for just wars. Not just the U.S. in its recent history, but almost any country that starts a war will say it's justified for one reason or another.
So you see, Pope Francis is unequivocal. The just war theory, as it has been understood by the church and by the secular world for hundreds, if not thousands of years, needs to go. The question is, what's it to be replaced with, according to Pope Francis? Now, should it be the UN? And that's what Pope Francis suggests, and he suggests in other parts of Fratelli Tutti things, many different policies and ideas need to be devolved or moved to the UN, and Pope Francis even suggests a quote-unquote UN with teeth, or a UN with the force that can be used to compel participants to do what they decide. It's a huge change in church policy in the way the world views wars. Pope Francis lays out no real alternative to the current view on the just war theory, just that he doesn't find it valid anymore and he wants some other institution to take over. I personally don't know what Pope Francis's true idea is with this declaration. The system of just war as it is right now isn't perfect, but it also shouldn't be tossed away without a concrete plan to replace it. You really just can't throw away the baby with the bathwater and expect something new to arise out of it. Why is the church, which has traditionally had a seat at the table at these conversations, just completely stepping away from the table? That's another aspect of it. That a major player, an institution that is supposed to be speaking to the morality of issues today. We all know to some degree war is immoral. War is definitely an ugly thing, but it's going to happen. So an organization that's meant to be providing moral authority on this is just saying, okay, we're out. What's going to replace it? I don't know. I'd love to know what you think about this, and definitely leave your ideas and your thoughts in the comments below. Is Pope Francis over the target on this one, or is he being completely irresponsible? I hope you enjoyed another bit of papal history and church history in 10 minutes. Thank you to all the patrons on patreon.com. Join us over there to support the show. It helps out so much. Make sure you click, like, and subscribe, and ring the bell to get more videos like this, and I will see you next time.